The city was waking up to another busy morning. Cars honked, people rushed down the sidewalks, and the air smelled of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint scent of rain. Among the crowd was a young woman named Lena, hurrying toward the bus stop. She was dressed neatly, clutching her bag and a cup of hot coffee that she had barely taken a sip from. Her eyes were fixed on her phone screen, reading through emails she had to reply to before the morning meeting. It was one of those mornings when everything felt like a race against time. The traffic light seemed slower, the crowd thicker, and her mind was already filled with tasks before the day had even begun. She had worked hard to build her career, and every minute mattered to her. But in that rush, she didn't notice the small puddle of water on the sidewalk. Her heel slipped, and the next moment, her coffee cup flew from her hand, spilling all over her clothes and the ground. The people walking past barely slowed down. Some glanced her way, others simply stepped around her and continued walking. She knelt down, feeling embarrassed as her papers scattered. Her hands trembled slightly, partly from the shock and partly from frustration. She muttered under her breath, trying not to cry even though the start of her day already felt ruined. Then, a calm voice broke through the noise of the street.
"Hey, are you okay?"
Lena looked up. A man was kneeling beside her, holding out a few napkins. He wasn't in a rush. His eyes were kind and patient, and he spoke as if they weren't surrounded by hundreds of people moving fast around them. He helped her pick up her scattered papers and gently handed them back. "I'm fine," she said, trying to smile despite the mess. "Just one of those mornings." He smiled back, not saying much, just nodding. "Happens to all of us," he said softly. There was something about the way he said it that made her feel calmer. Most people would have just walked away, but he stayed until she was steady again. When she stood up, he handed her one last napkin. "There's a bookstore just across the street. If you need a moment, you can clean up there. It's quiet." Lena thanked him and crossed the street, following his direction. She hadn't noticed the small bookstore before, tucked between a bakery and a flower shop. The door creaked gently as she entered. Inside, it felt like stepping into another world, warm, quiet, and filled with the comforting scent of old books. Behind the counter stood the same man who had helped her. "Oh," she said, surprised, "this is your store?" He chuckled lightly. "Yeah, I thought you might need a place to breathe." He offered her a seat near the window and brought her a cup of tea without asking for payment. "It's on the house," he said. "You look like you could use it." Lena sat there for a few minutes, sipping the tea. The warmth spread through her fingers and calmed her nerves. She watched the people rushing outside and realized how quiet it was inside the store. For a few moments, it felt like the world had slowed down. They talked for a bit. He asked about her work, and she mentioned how stressful it could be. He listened without interrupting, occasionally smiling or nodding. When she asked about his store, he said he had been running it for years. A small place that sold used books and rare editions. It wasn't much, he said, but it made him happy. When she finally left, she felt lighter. That small act of kindness, someone stopping to help, offering a quiet place, and listening, it had changed the tone of her entire day. The next morning, as Lena waited for her bus, she found herself glancing across the street at the bookstore. The lights were on, and she could see the man arranging books on the shelf. She hesitated for a moment, but decided to cross the street again. When she stepped in, he looked up and smiled. "Back already? I never got to thank you properly yesterday," she said, "and I thought maybe I could buy a book this time." He laughed softly. "You don't have to, but I'll take that as a good sign." They talked again, this time about books. Lena admitted she hadn't read much lately. Her job left little time for things that didn't have to do with work. He handed her a book and said, "Try this one. It's not long, but it might remind you to slow down once in a while." She turned the cover and read the title. It was a story about finding meaning in small moments, about how even the simplest gestures can change lives. She smiled. "You really believe that?" she asked. He nodded. "I do. Most people remember the big things, but sometimes it's the little ones that stay with us forever." Lena left with the book and read it that evening. Something about the words stayed in her mind. The next few days she found herself visiting the bookstore more often, sometimes to buy a new book, sometimes just to talk. She learned that his name was Daniel. He lived in the small apartment above the store and loved quiet mornings when the sunlight came through the window and fell on the rows of old books. He told her he had once worked in a corporate job too, but left it years ago because he wanted a slower, more meaningful life. At first, Lena found it strange, giving up a stable career to run a small bookstore. But the more she listened, the more she understood. Daniel seemed genuinely content. He didn't measure his life in promotions or paychecks. He measured it in the people he met, the stories he read, and the peace he felt each day. One afternoon, after a tiring week at work, Lena stopped by again. Daniel noticed the stress on her face. Without asking, he poured her a cup of tea and placed it on the counter. "Bad day?" he asked. "Long day," she sighed. "Sometimes it feels like everything I do doesn't really matter. Just numbers, meetings, and deadlines." He didn't say much. He just leaned against the counter and said, "Maybe you're looking in the wrong place for meaning." His words lingered. That evening, she sat by her window at home and thought about them. She realized how rare it was to meet someone who truly listened, not because they had to, but because they cared. Over the next few weeks, their conversations grew longer. Sometimes they talked about books, other times about life. Daniel would tell stories about people who came into his store and how one kind word or smile could change someone's day. He spoke with warmth that made everything sound simple yet deep. One Saturday morning, Lena came by with pastries from the bakery next door. "For the best tea in town," she said jokingly. They sat by the window, sharing breakfast while the rain drizzled outside. The streets were quiet, and the sound of raindrops against the glass filled the silence between them. Daniel looked out the window and said, "Funny how we met, isn't it?" "Just a spilled coffee." Lena laughed. "Yeah, I was so embarrassed that day." "But if that hadn't happened," he said, smiling, "you might never have come here." She thought about that and nodded. "Maybe some accidents are meant to happen." He chuckled softly. "Maybe." For Lena, that small bookstore began to feel like a safe space, a place where the world slowed down, where she didn't have to be perfect or in control. She could just be. Each time she left, Daniel would remind her to take it easy. "Life isn't always a race," he'd say. "Sometimes it's just a walk through a bookstore." And every time she smiled a little wider. As weeks turned into months, Lena noticed subtle changes in herself. She still worked hard, but she started taking breaks. She read more. She took walks without her phone in hand. She even started talking to strangers more kindly, remembering how much a simple act of kindness had changed her. She didn't realize it yet. But that one small moment, the morning when she slipped and spilled her coffee, had quietly set the beginning of something that would stay with her forever. Days began to move in a softer rhythm for Lena. Work was still demanding, but she found herself looking forward to something new. The quiet hours spent inside that little bookstore. It had become her peaceful corner in a noisy world. Each time she entered, the bell above the door would chime, and Daniel would look up with that familiar, gentle smile. It wasn't the kind of greeting you gave to a customer. It was something warmer, something that made her feel noticed in a way the rest of the world often didn't. At first, she told herself it was just a habit, stopping by to read or have tea after work. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The place carried a calm that reminded her of who she used to be before life became a checklist of goals and deadlines. One evening, she arrived later than usual. The city outside was wrapped in soft golden light from the sunset, and through the window she could see Daniel arranging a small display near the front. She stood outside for a moment, watching how focused he was before quietly stepping in. "You're here," he said, glancing up with a smile. "I thought you might skip today." "Almost did," she said, setting down her bag. "But then I realized this is the only place that doesn't feel like work." "That's a good reason to come," he said with a grin. He poured her a cup of tea and set it beside the chair she usually sat in. The shop was empty except for them, and the light from the setting sun gave everything a golden glow. She looked around, the shelves full of books, the soft sound of pages turning from the small reading corner, and thought how rare it was to find something so peaceful in the middle of the city. "Do you ever get lonely here?" she asked suddenly. Daniel paused. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "but I don't mind it. It's a quiet kind of loneliness, the kind you make peace with." She thought about that for a moment. "I don't think I've ever known peace with loneliness," she said softly. "For me, it's always just empty." He nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe because you're used to the noise, the meetings, the calls, the rush. When that goes quiet, it feels strange." She looked out the window, watching people hurry past. "I guess so. Silence makes me think too much. He smiled slightly. Then you're in the right place. Books talk without making noise. She laughed, and for the first time in a long while, the laughter didn't feel forced. From that day on, she began spending more time there. Sometimes reading, sometimes helping Daniel organize books, and sometimes just sitting quietly while he worked. She liked the rhythm of the place. There was no pressure, no competition, no one trying to prove anything. Just small, honest moments. One afternoon, a little girl came into the store with her father, looking for a school book. Daniel knelt to help her reach a book on the lower shelf and began chatting with her. Lena watched how naturally he spoke to the child, making her laugh and easing her shyness. It was simple but beautiful, a reminder that kindness could be soft, not loud. When the girl left, Lena said, "You're good with people." Daniel shrugged. "I just try to make them feel seen. Everyone carries something, stress, sadness, or worry. Sometimes they just need someone to be kind without asking for anything back." Lena looked at him quietly, realizing that was exactly what he had done for her. One evening, as the rain began to pour outside, Lena stayed longer than usual. The streets were shining under the streetlights, and the sound of raindrops against the window filled the room. Daniel made her another cup of tea and brought out a small plate of cookies. "This is nice," she said softly. "I don't remember the last time I just sat like this and doing nothing, just listening to the rain." "That's because most people think doing nothing is wasting time," he said. "But sometimes doing nothing helps you find something you didn't know you'd lost." She tilted her head. "Like what?" "Yourself," he said simply. His words hit deeper than he knew. That night when she went home, she couldn't stop thinking about them. In the following weeks, Lena started to change little things in her life. She stopped eating lunch at her desk. She took walks after work, sometimes without checking her phone once. She noticed small things again, the color of the sky at sunset, the sound of footsteps in puddles, the laughter of strangers at a cafe. And every time she stopped by the bookstore, she felt like she was reconnecting with a part of herself she had forgotten. One Saturday, she came in holding a bag of pastries. "Breakfast for the bookstore owner," she said cheerfully. Daniel laughed. "You know, you don't have to keep bringing food every time you come here." "But it's fun," she replied, handing him the bag. "You give me tea. I bring pastries. It's fair trade." He smiled, shaking his head. "Fair enough." As they ate by the window, she asked, "Have you always wanted to own a bookstore?" He thought for a moment. "Not always. I used to work in an office. I had a good job, good pay, all the things people think they want. But I wasn't happy. I'd come home exhausted every night, wondering if I was actually living or just existing. Then one day I walked past this empty shop and thought, what if I tried something different?" "And you did it," she said, surprised. He nodded. "Best decision I ever made. I didn't know much about running a business, but I knew I wanted to build a place where people could breathe." Lena smiled. "Well, you succeeded. This place feels like another world." He looked at her for a moment and said softly, "Maybe it's not the place. Maybe it's the people in it." Her heart skipped slightly, but she didn't say anything. She looked down at her cup, pretending to stir her tea, though it didn't need stirring. As weeks passed, she began helping around the store more often. She'd organize shelves, decorate displays, and sometimes recommend books to new visitors. Daniel would tease her, saying she was becoming part of the store. One day, when a delivery of books arrived, she stayed to help unpack them. They worked side by side for hours, chatting and laughing. There were moments when their hands brushed and neither said anything. But both felt something gentle and unspoken growing quietly between them. Late that evening, when they finally finished, Daniel turned off the lights except for the one by the window. "Thanks for staying," he said. "Couldn't have done it this fast alone." Lena smiled. "I should be thanking you. This is more peaceful than any evening I've had in months." They stood in silence for a while, watching the lights outside. Then Daniel said, "Funny how a small accident can change everything, isn't it?" She nodded. "If I hadn't spilled that coffee." He chuckled softly. You might never have found this place. Or met you, she added quietly. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and then she looked away, smiling. There was no need for big words. The silence said enough. From then on, it became their routine. Lena would stop by the bookstore after work, sometimes bringing snacks, sometimes just herself. They talked about everything. Books, dreams, childhood memories, even fears. Daniel never tried to impress her, and she never tried to hide who she was. Their connection grew not from grand moments, but from small, honest ones. One evening, as they were closing, Daniel handed her a small wrapped book. "For you," he said. "What's this?" she asked, curious. "Just something I thought you might like," he said. When she unwrapped it, she found an old, slightly worn copy of the same book he had recommended months ago, the one about finding meaning in small moments. She smiled, touched. "You remembered." "Of course," he said simply. "It reminded me of you." Lena held the book close, feeling something warm in her chest. That night, as she walked home under the streetlights, she realized she hadn't just found a bookstore. She had found a piece of peace she didn't know she was missing. And maybe something even more. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks quietly melted into months. The little bookstore had now become a part of Lena's life, just like her morning coffee or her evening walks. It was no longer just a place she visited. It was her escape, her comfort, her second home. She had grown close to Daniel in ways that surprised her. It wasn't about big moments or dramatic gestures. It was the simple things. The way he remembered how she liked her tea, the quiet laughter they shared over small jokes, the way he listened when she spoke about her day. But one Friday evening when she stopped by after work, something felt different. The lights inside the bookstore were dim, and the door was locked. She checked her phone, thinking maybe she was early, but it was the usual time. She waited for a few minutes, hoping Daniel would appear from somewhere nearby, but he didn't. After a while, she turned to leave, feeling a small wave of worry she couldn't explain. It wasn't like him to close early without notice. The next day, she tried again. The door was still locked, and this time, a small note was taped to the glass. It read, "Closed for a few days. Sorry for the inconvenience." Lena stood there staring at the note. The handwriting was Daniel's, neat but shaky. She felt a heaviness in her chest. Something wasn't right. She called his phone, but there was no answer. She tried again the next day. Still nothing. A part of her told herself he was fine, maybe just taking time off. But her heart said otherwise. 3 days later, she got a message from the young assistant who sometimes helped in the shop. The message was short. "Daniel isn't well. He's in the hospital." The words hit her like a sudden gust of cold air. Without thinking twice, she asked which hospital he was in and rushed there right after work. When she arrived, she saw him through the small glass window of his room. He looked pale and tired, a tube attached to his arm. He was sitting up, reading a book, still trying to stay calm even when his body was clearly exhausted. She knocked softly on the door and stepped in. His eyes widened in surprise. "Lena?" he said weakly, though his smile tried to stay steady. "You didn't tell me," she said, walking closer, trying to hide the emotion in her voice. "I didn't want to worry you," he said, still smiling. "It's just a bit of exhaustion. I've been overworking lately." She pulled a chair beside his bed and sat down. "You scared me," she said quietly. "I'm sorry," he replied, his tone soft. "I didn't mean to." There was a silence between them, filled only by the faint sound of the machines beside his bed. She could see how tired his eyes looked, and suddenly all the little things she had taken for granted, his steady presence, his warmth, his laughter, felt fragile, precious. She noticed a half-finished cup of tea on the table beside him. "You even have tea here," she said with a small smile. He chuckled lightly. Some habits don't leave, even in hospitals. They talked for a while. He told her that he had fainted one morning while opening the store. The doctor said it was stress and exhaustion. He had been trying to manage too many things alone. You should have asked for help, she said, her voice a mix of concern and frustration. He looked at her gently. You already do enough by being there. I didn't want to bother you. She sighed. You're impossible. He smiled. That's what keeps life interesting. When the nurse came in to check his vitals, Lena stepped aside, watching quietly. It hurt to see him like that. Someone who had always seemed so strong and calm now looking so small and tired. That night she stayed with him until visiting hours were over. Before leaving, she said softly, I'll come back tomorrow. He nodded, his eyes soft. You don't have to. I want to, she said before he could finish. The next day she came again, and the day after that. Every evening after finishing work she would stop by the hospital. Sometimes she brought him food, sometimes books, and sometimes she just sat there reading aloud while he rested. One evening, while reading to him, she noticed his eyes closed. She stopped, thinking he was asleep, but then he spoke quietly. Your voice makes even the words sound calm, he said without opening his eyes. She smiled faintly. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me. He opened his eyes then and looked at her. I mean it. For a moment they just looked at each other, and the air between them felt heavier, but in a good way, like something unspoken was finally being understood. Weeks passed and slowly Daniel began to recover. When he was finally discharged, Lena helped him back to his apartment above the bookstore. She made him promise not to go back to work too soon. I'll take care of the store until you're ready, she said firmly. He tried to protest, but she crossed her arms. Don't argue. You need rest. I can handle a few books, he laughed. You're more stubborn than I thought. And you're worse at taking care of yourself than I imagined, she replied. So for the next few weeks, Lena managed the store. It was strange at first being on the other side of the counter. But with every customer she greeted, every shelf she organized, she realized how much the store meant, not just to Daniel, but to the small community around it. Regular visitors asked about him. Some brought flowers or cards. One little boy even drew a picture of the bookstore with Daniel smiling behind the counter. Lena taped it to the wall. Every evening after closing, she would take him tea upstairs and tell him how the day went. They'd sit by the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. One night, as they watched the rain fall outside, Daniel said quietly, You know, I don't remember the last time I felt this cared for. Lena looked at him. You've spent years caring for others. Maybe it's your turn. He smiled faintly. It feels strange, being the one taken care of. She nodded. It's okay to need people sometimes. You don't always have to do everything alone. He didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said more than words could. Over the next month, Daniel slowly regained his strength. He began helping downstairs again, though Lena still insisted he take it easy. They worked side by side, laughing, talking, and sometimes teasing each other like old friends. One afternoon, a customer came in, an elderly woman who had been visiting the store for years. She saw Daniel and smiled warmly. I'm so glad you're better, she said. We were all worried about you. Daniel thanked her, and after she left, he turned to Lena. You see? Even the regulars noticed. Of course they did, she said. You're not just a bookstore owner to them. You're part of their lives. He looked at her thoughtfully. And you're part of mine now. Lena's breath caught for a second. She didn't know what to say, so she just smiled softly and went back to arranging books, but her heart was racing. That evening, as they closed the shop, Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her stack the last few books. You know, he said, the day you walked in here after spilling your coffee, I had no idea it would change my life. She looked up, surprised. Change your life? He nodded. I was used to quiet days, used to being alone. Then you came along, with your laughter, your energy, your kindness. You made this place feel alive again. Lena felt her cheeks warm. You've changed mine too, she said softly. I used to think kindness was just something small, something that didn't really matter. But now I see it's what keeps everything together. They stood there for a moment, both smiling, both knowing that their bond had become something deep, something beyond friendship, built not on grand gestures but on small acts of care and understanding. That night, after she went home, Lena sat by her window, Watching the city lights, she thought about everything that had happened, how a simple accident had led her to a person who had quietly changed her life. She realized it wasn't luck or fate, but the power of human connection. One moment of kindness had created something real, something that might just last forever. The warm days of spring slowly arrived, bringing sunlight that spilled through the bookstore windows. The city outside was full of noise and movement, but inside that little shop, time still moved softly. The shelves stood full, the smell of old paper lingered in the air, and laughter occasionally broke the quiet whenever Daniel and Lena worked together. By now, it was impossible to imagine the store without her. She had become part of its rhythm, helping customers, arranging displays, writing small handwritten notes to go with each book. Sometimes Daniel would watch her from across the room as she spoke kindly to customers, or smiled at children who came in with their parents. It made him feel proud, not because of how much she helped, but because of how much life she had brought into his world. One morning, while they were having tea at the counter, Lena said, "You know, I've been thinking, we should try taking the bookstore online." Daniel looked up from the newspaper. "Online, as in selling books on the internet?" "Yes," she said excitedly. "You've got so many unique titles here. There are people out there who would love to buy them. It could help the store grow." He smiled faintly. "I wouldn't even know where to start." "I could help," she said quickly. "I know how to design simple websites. We can create a small online shop, add your favorite book picks, maybe even write little reviews. It could be fun." Daniel looked at her for a moment and then nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's try it your way." That was how it began. Long evenings spent side by side in the small back room of the bookstore, surrounded by stacks of books and the quiet hum of Lena's laptop. She worked patiently, showing him how to take photos, write short descriptions, and upload them. He was slow at first, but she never lost her patience. "Click here," she'd say gently, guiding him. "No, not there. Yes, that's it." He would laugh and say, "You make it sound easy." "It is," she'd tease. "You just think too much before doing it." He would smile. "I've been told that before." Sometimes they worked late into the night. When the lights outside dimmed and the city grew quiet, they would sit by the window sipping tea, talking about everything and nothing. Lena told him stories about her childhood, how she used to visit a small library near her home, how she loved the smell of new books but could never afford to buy many. Daniel shared his memories too, how his father had loved reading to him every night, and how that love for stories never left him. They often lost track of time. The work was slow, but neither minded. It wasn't just about creating a website anymore. It was about creating something together. By early summer, the online store was ready. Lena showed him the final version one evening. "Look," she said proudly, turning the laptop toward him. The screen displayed the bookstore's name in elegant letters, photos of shelves filled with books, and a small note that read, "A place where stories find a home." Daniel stared at it for a moment, then looked at her. "You did this," he said quietly. "We did this," she corrected. He smiled. "It's beautiful." They launched the site the next day, not expecting much. But within a week, the first few orders came in. Then more followed. People began leaving kind messages online about how they loved the personal notes Daniel added with each book. Soon, their evenings turned into little celebrations. Every time an order came in, Lena would clap her hands and say, "Another one," while Daniel laughed and tried to keep up with packaging. "This is all you're doing," he said one night as they packed books. "No," she said. "This is because of you. People can feel the love you put into this place." As the online shop grew, so did their friendship. But beneath it, something deeper was quietly building. Something neither of them said aloud, yet both felt. It was in the way they looked at each other when they laughed, in the small silences that felt comfortable, in the soft care that filled their every gesture. One evening, after a long day of work, they stepped out to close the store. The air was warm, carrying the scent of flowers from the nearby shop. Daniel locked the door and leaned against the wall, looking up at the night sky. "You know," he said, "this place feels different now." "How so?" Lena asked. He thought for a moment. "Before you came, it was just a shop. Quiet, peaceful, but a little lonely. Now it feels alive. It has laughter again." Lena smiled softly. Maybe it just needed a little company. He turned to look at her, his eyes warm. Maybe I did too. There was a brief silence. She looked down, hiding the slight blush on her cheeks. From that night onward, things between them began to shift in quiet ways. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was gentle, like the changing of seasons. They began sharing dinners after closing time, sometimes cooking simple meals upstairs in Daniel's small kitchen. Lena often teased him for his terrible cooking skills, and he would laugh, saying, "That's why I keep you around." They found comfort in the ordinary, washing dishes together, watering the plants outside the store, or sitting by the window during quiet evenings. One day, a customer left a kind review online that said, "This bookstore feels like it was made with love." Lena read it aloud and laughed. "They think we're running a romantic shop," Daniel chuckled. "Maybe they're not wrong." Her laughter softened into silence, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Something unspoken passed between them, something that didn't need to be defined. But just when everything seemed perfect, life reminded them that nothing stays the same forever. One morning, Daniel received a letter from the building owner. The rent for the shop was going to increase and almost double what he was paying. It felt like a heavy blow. Lena found him sitting quietly at the counter, holding the letter in his hands. "What happened?" she asked. He handed it to her without a word. As she read, her heart sank. "They can't do this," she said firmly. "This place means too much to too many people," he sighed. "It's business. The city's changing. Maybe it's time to let it go." "No," she said quickly. "We'll find a way. We'll do something, maybe a community event, a fundraiser, or an open reading day. We can't just give up." He looked at her, his eyes tired but filled with admiration. "You really believe we can save it?" "I do," she said, her voice steady. "You once told me small moments can change everything. Let's make this one count," and so they tried. They organized an event, a day of stories, where people could come, read aloud, share experiences, and buy books. Lena designed posters, called local newspapers, and even convinced nearby shops to help. The day of the event arrived, and the bookstore buzzed with life. There were children sitting on the floor listening to stories, older readers discussing their favorite books, and the smell of coffee and pastries filled the air. Daniel stood in a corner watching the scene unfold. His eyes shimmered as he whispered, "Look at this place." Lena joined him. "See? I told you people love this store." He nodded, his voice soft. "They do, but not as much as I do." She turned to him, her heart skipping. "The store?" she asked with a half smile. He looked at her, his voice quiet but clear. "No, you." The words hung in the air, gentle yet powerful. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked around, at the laughter, the warmth, the life that surrounded them, and realized that everything she had been searching for was right here. She smiled, her eyes meeting his. "You have a way of saying things that make me forget how to speak," he smiled back. "Then don't say anything. Just stay." They didn't need grand confessions or promises. The look in their eyes said enough. Two people who had found something rare in a world that moved too fast. Peace, understanding, and love born from kindness. That night, as the bookstore lights dimmed and the streets grew quiet again, they stood by the window, side by side. The reflection of the city lights dancing across the glass. The store had been saved. But more than that, something even more lasting had been built within its walls. A connection that began with one small act of kindness and had now become the very heartbeat of their lives. The days after the big event felt different. The bookstore, once quiet and uncertain, was now filled with a steady rhythm of footsteps and soft chatter. People came not just to buy books, but to share memories. They'd tell stories about how the shop reminded them of childhood, or how a certain book changed their life. Daniel often stood behind the counter, quietly listening, while Lena moved between the shelves, helping customers find just the right story. Sometimes their eyes would meet from across the room and they'd smile, a silent reminder of everything they'd been through together. The rent issue had been solved for now. The building owner, moved by the community's love for the shop, agreed to keep the old rate for another few years. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it gave them time and hope. One evening after closing, they sat on the floor among scattered books and empty coffee cups. The event banners still hung by the windows, glowing softly under the streetlights outside. Lena leaned her head back against the shelf. Can you believe it's been a whole year since we first met? Daniel thought back to that rainy day when she had walked in, helping him with those fallen boxes. It feels longer, he said quietly. In a good way, she smiled. It's strange, isn't it? How one small moment can change everything. He nodded. That's how life works, I suppose. We never see the big moments coming. They just sneak in quietly. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside. It wasn't the loud kind of happiness they felt. It was something deeper, calmer. Over the next few months, their lives settled into a gentle rhythm. The bookstore thrived. The online shop grew steadily, and people from other cities began ordering books. They even started a small reading club every Saturday, where people gathered to discuss their favorite novels. Daniel and Lena became a familiar sight, always together, always busy, always smiling. But underneath that routine, something unspoken remained, a feeling that had deepened over time, yet neither had put into words. One late afternoon, while Lena was organizing the front display, Daniel came out of the back room holding an old book. The cover was worn and faded, its pages yellowed with age. What's that? She asked, wiping her hands on her apron. It's my father's old journal, he said softly. I found it while cleaning upstairs. He used to write little thoughts about life and people. She walked closer and sat beside him as he opened it. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, small notes, and underlined quotes. He read one aloud. Kindness is the quiet bridge between strangers and friends, and sometimes between two hearts. Lena smiled. That's beautiful, he nodded slowly. He always believed that kindness was what kept the world from falling apart. She looked at him for a long moment. I think he was right. They spent the rest of the evening reading the journal together. Each line felt like a soft echo of everything they had lived through. The small act of kindness that had brought them together, the laughter, the struggles, the hope. When they closed the book, Daniel said quietly, I think he'd have liked you. Lena smiled softly. I hope so. Then, after a small pause, she added, Do you ever think about what's next? He looked up. Next? I mean, life. Where we go from here. He took a deep breath. Sometimes. But lately I've learned not to plan too much. Some of the best things happen when you least expect them. She nodded. That's true, the weeks rolled on. Summer turned to autumn again, and the city changed its colors. The trees along the street glowed gold and orange, and the air smelled of roasted coffee and rain. Inside the shop, the shelves were now lined with candles and autumn books. One quiet evening, as Daniel was closing the register, Lena came in holding a small envelope. This came for you, she said, placing it on the counter. He opened it and read silently for a moment. Then his eyes softened. What is it? She asked. It's from a publisher, he said with a small smile. They've seen our online reviews and want to feature the bookstore in their upcoming magazine. Lena's face lit up. That's amazing. You'll be famous now, he laughed. I think I've had enough excitement for one lifetime. But deep down, he felt something shift. For years, he had thought his life was winding down, that the best chapters were already behind him. But now it felt like a new story was still being written. That night, after locking up, they went for a walk. The streets were quiet, leaves crunching under their feet. They didn't talk much, just walked side by side under the soft streetlights. Finally, Lena spoke. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come into your store that day? He smiled. Every day. And every time I do, I thank whatever brought you here. She laughed gently. Fate, maybe? Or just a bit of kindness, he said. They stopped at the corner where the light from the shop window glowed behind them. For a long moment, they just stood there. Then Daniel turned to her, his voice quiet but steady. You once told me kindness can change everything. You were right. It changed me. She looked up at him, her eyes warm. It changed me too. He hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. I don't know what the future holds, he said, but I know I want you in it. Her eyes glistened as she nodded. You don't have to ask. I'm already there. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It didn't need to be. It was two people finding peace in each other, not through grand gestures, but through quiet moments shared over books, laughter, and trust. Over the next few years, their story continued quietly. The bookstore became a landmark in their neighborhood, Students, travelers, and locals came in, often hearing about the place through friends or articles. Sometimes customers would ask how it all began. Daniel would smile and say, "With one small act of kindness." And Lena, standing beside him, would always add, "And a lot of stories in between." The two eventually expanded the store. They opened a small cafe corner inside, where people could sit and read with a cup of coffee. It became the heart of the place, where new friendships started, where laughter filled the air. Every morning they'd open the doors together. Lena would fix the flowers by the window, and Daniel would brew coffee before turning the sign to open. It became their ritual, simple, quiet, and full of meaning. Years passed, and the city kept changing. New buildings rose, new people came and went, but the little bookstore remained, standing like a small piece of warmth in the middle of a busy world. One rainy afternoon, a young girl entered the shop, drenched and shivering. She had dropped her umbrella outside and was clearly nervous. Daniel looked up and smiled kindly. "Come in, you're safe here. Warm up first." She nodded shyly, clutching her wet bag. Lena came out from the back with a towel and a cup of hot tea. "Here," she said gently. "You'll catch a cold if you stay like that." The girl looked surprised. "Thank you," she whispered. As Daniel watched, he felt a familiar feeling, the same warmth that had started everything years ago. A small act of kindness given freely. When the girl finally left, Lena turned to him and said, "Remind you of someone?" He smiled. "Yes, and it reminds me how everything beautiful starts with something small." She stepped closer and squeezed his hand. "Let's never stop doing that, the small things." "Never," he said softly. Outside, the rain continued to fall, just as it had on the day they met. The sound of it against the windows mixed with the soft music playing inside. Daniel looked around at the shelves, the warm lights, the smell of books, and then at Lena, the person who had walked into his life by chance but had stayed by choice. He realized then that kindness wasn't just a single act. It was a way of living, a gentle thread that could weave two lives together, turning strangers into family and moments into forever. And as they stood together, the world outside moved on, fast and noisy. But inside that little bookstore, time once again slowed down. Just enough for two people who had learned that one small act of kindness could truly spark a lifetime connection.